It's a habit so ingrained in our daily lives that many of us take it for granted. Roll over in bed in the morning, reach for your phone and open your favorite news, social media or messaging app. That's how pervasive digital communication tools have become. We barely give them a second thought. But behind these everyday habits lie major economic and developmental questions, layered under major buzzwords like the Internet of Things, cloud computing, e-commerce, and artificial intelligence that are shaping how we interface with the digital world in our lives, as well as the formidable economic sectors spawned by these technologies. Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of G20 Focus. I'm Thulasizwe Simelane. We are exactly 27 days away from the G20 Leaders Summit, where aspects of the global digital economy will also come under the spotlight. And that's because digital technologies are said to contribute to about 70% of the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Bank says, for example, countries with stronger digital infrastructure and digital affordability have made 40% more progress towards achieving the SDGs compared to their peers in the same income group. And get this, according to the latest Global Digital Report, no one, absolutely no one else in the world spends as much time on the internet as South Africans do, with an average of 9 hours and 37 minutes a day. And as for social media usage, Kenya rules the roost when it comes to time spent on social media, an average of 4 hours and 13 minutes, followed by Chile and South Africa in third with an average of 3 hours and 36 minutes a day. But that's usage. What about access, connectivity, speeds, the infrastructure underlying all of it, and importantly, the developmental and economic impact of these technologies? While Africa has made progress on its digital economy, driven by increased connectivity, the growth of sectors like e-commerce and fintech, and a young, tech-savvy population, that progress is uneven. The latest Afrobarometer policy paper states that on average, across 39 African countries that it surveyed, only 18% of respondents personally owned a computer, and a further 15% had access to a computer in their household. Fewer than half owned a smartphone, and only 31% used the internet on a daily basis. This situation describes the digital divide, which is the gulf between those who have ready access to computers and the internet and those who do not. So tonight we ask, how can Africa accelerate an inclusive digital economy? Joining us for this discussion in studio are Professor Bartholomew, Armah, who is the Senior Economic Advisor to the CEO of AUDA-NEPAD, a development agency of the African Union, as well as Professor Vukosi, Marivat, who is Computer Science Lecturer and AI Researcher at the University of Pretoria, also co-founder of Lelapi AI. We're also joined virtually by Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, Malatsi. And a bit later on, we will be joined by Garth Scholtz, who is the General Manager of the South African Broadband Networks. So that's where we are going with the conversation. But before we get started, before we get into the discussions this evening, for context, let's get an understanding of what the digital economy entails and whether it will have any impact on employment.
When we speak about digital transformation, there are certain enablers that we must put in place. If you choose that you want to be a digital economy, everyone in that digital economy must be connected to the internet. If you choose to want to be a innovative driven, then you call the gig economy. Then you must be able to invest your funds and everything within the inventions, right? And there's another one called the circular economy. In a circular economy is that you have more consumerist kind of energy. Then you must make sure that whatever you have sustains you longer. So we as South Africa, we've chosen to follow the digital economy. So we must make sure that firstly, our people are connected in the internet, everybody. We must make sure that the infrastructure is a network of networks. We must make sure that the gadgets that are required are smart enough for people to be able to enable the services. And the biggest thing is affordability. that everyone must be able to afford to be in this space.
Often what happens is that people have this misconception that robotics and AI and machines and all of those things are in fact creating such efficiency that it's taking away jobs. What that presents is a great opportunity for us as leaders in order to reskill, upskill, and ensure that we have the relevant skills of our population. We have a fantastic opportunity because we have an emerging middle class, we have a great youth population. What we need to do is teach the right skills that fit the demand of what's needed not only in South Africa but beyond.
All right, so let's unpack this discussion this evening, and I'm privileged to be joined by subject matter specialists. So we will pull it and dissect it in multiple directions. But I want us to start with the definitional and foundational elements before we get to the more layered discussions. If we're talking about the digital divide, Prof. Bartholomew, let me start with you. What is the picture currently on the African continent of access, of use of these technologies, digital technologies, but also use in the context of economic growth and economic opportunity?
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. Now, the digital economy is supposed to contribute at least $1.5 trillion to the African economy by 2030. Now, when we talk about the digital economy in terms of, the digital divide, we're talking about access. We are also talking about, within access, we're talking about the cost. But in terms of the divide, we can also look at it in terms of the digital divide within countries and between countries, right? Yeah. Now, the key elements of these are the access to the digital infrastructure, meaning access to the internet, which is also a function of access to energy, access to cloud computing technologies. And in that respect, the divide is a function also of the incomes of individuals and the skills that individuals will have. So really, looking at the continent in terms of internet access and access to broadband, the figures are quite low relative to the global averages, in the 20% in terms of internet access. Yeah. But what we need to look at is how the digital technologies vary in terms of access between rural and urban areas, the quality of access, the cost. We've seen situations where governments are taxing mobile telephony transactions, which then means that since it's a fixed cost, it is a regressive taxation in the sense that those who have, it doesn't matter how much income you have. So that is a factor that affects the digital divide.
Please pick up on that, Professor Marivat. What works, what precipitates for greater access on the African continent? What is hindering access?
So I come at this from a different perspective, one being a machine learning or AI researcher. So at the end of the day, there's all of these platforms that you want people to get access to. I think picking up on what Prof said, for example, what happens in an urban area versus a rural area becomes a very big challenge. We have seen in some areas in developing some of these technologies that now more and more of even handset manufacturers are trying to make sure that they localize some of the material, right? So that you can now access a phone that more in the language in whatever African country that you're in, remembering that we have 2,000 plus languages on the continent. But at the same time, yes, you're going to have foundational challenges. If you need that cloud computing, where's the energy going to?
So you come in once the tracks have been laid, and you want to come in with the high-speed train.
It is not necessarily so. I also work with AUDA-NEPAD for the AI white paper back in 2022, 2023. And one of the challenges we identified in the infrastructure chapter was this part of, if you're going to be active in a AI machine learning driven economy, where's your connectivity, and then where's your energy going to be? And you're going to have to then think very innovatively on how you're going to build up that infrastructure.
Yeah.
It might just be in regions, maybe not thinking that every country has to have big data centers to power these graphical GPUs, but regions might be able to bring this together.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is, if you travel across the continent, that even how some of this infrastructure is treated is very different. I can say as a user more than a person like Prof or the minister who are trying to lay those railroads, is that you see that in one country it's easy for you to get really connected, and in another one it's really like, you know, you have these layers that you have to get through.
So in a way I'm picking up similarities with the energy infrastructure conversation as well, especially around that regionalization that you raised. I will tease you a little bit more on it a bit later on, but let me bring in Minister Malatsi. Minister, in the clip that we played in the opening, we were talking about, one of the speakers there was talking about the strategy that South Africa has chosen in terms of the economy either being a digital economy or a circular economy, gig economy. And the point was being made that we've chosen the digital economy route of things. And I understand that central to that is access, basic access. Paint a picture for us what that looks like in 2025.
Thanks very much to the season. Greetings to both profs in studio. Look, I mean, you shared a slide that was indicating the statistics in terms of connectivity and access. Currently, our stats indicate that at least on average, a quarter of the South African population remains outside of broadband connectivity. That means you've got approximately 23 million South Africans who wake up, unlike you and I, without access to that connectivity. And the opportunity cost of that is you are unable to then tap into the skills, you are unable to tap into the opportunities and the entrepreneurial spirit that those individuals would, in a world where connectivity is meaningful, which is the most important thing, because we can often speak about these things loosely. Connectivity on its own in this day and age is insufficient. It has to be meaningful connectivity, meaning that on a consistent basis, the quality of that connectivity that you get, irrespective of whether you are in the far north of the country, in a rural area, or you are in the central part of the country, in an urban area, that is equally the same. And then you look in terms of some of the stats that you shared, which are very interesting in terms of internet. A lot of South African, approximately around 60% of those is on social media use. And this is not to denigrate usage of social media, but a lot of that is driven by entertainment purposes. And in a thriving digital economy, you want to steer that towards e-commerce. You want to steer that towards e-learning. You want to steer that towards, entrepreneurship, so that it is about the productive use of the internet and not it being dominated by use for social or entertainment purposes.
Yeah, and that's one of the fascinating factors that I picked up as well when I was going into it, the balance between what people use the internet for, being information, getting in contact with people that they want to get in contact with, staying in contact, but also a large percentage that uses the internet for social media connectivity. So we've started the conversation. When we come back, we look at what's enabling connectivity on the African continent, the infrastructure, the extent to which that's been laid out, and what are the conditions that are making it possible to lay some of the basic infrastructure for connectivity, or that are hindering the ability for Africa to do exactly that. That and more still to come. You're watching G20 Focus. We're on SABC News, but we're also on SABC 2 and SABC Plus. Welcome back to G20 Focus. Now, I was saying earlier on that the reasons why people turn to the internet, what accounts for internet usage, these are global figures that came through from the Global Digital Report for 2024. They say that finding information, staying in touch with friends and family, keeping up to date with news and events, watching videos, TV shows or movies, etc., etc., those are the highest ranking. Now, what's making it possible is the infrastructure that's been laid. But what does that look like on the African continent? Take a look at this in terms of the digital divide on the African continent, who has access and who doesn't have access. These are the figures from the ITU that show us that by comparison of various regions, you will see that in Europe, only 1% of households cannot afford a fixed data package, whereas 9% cannot afford a 10 gigabytes mobile data package. So the differentiation there being between fixed and mobile data. And you then get the figures, corresponding figures for East Asia and the Pacific. But the figure we are interested in, that bottom bar, those two bottom bars there, Africa, you've got 72% of households who say they cannot afford a fixed data package, and then you have 96% who say they cannot afford 10 gigabytes of mobile data. That package cannot be afforded by those households. So those are the figures. Let's get into the infrastructure that's resulting in that picture. Prof, let me come back to you. There's been a great deal of progress. Let's not downplay that. In terms of laying of infrastructure for connectivity from the days of CECOM, the subsea cable, the first one on the continent, right? That was around, 2009, thereabouts. But where do we stand in terms of that technology proliferating, changing into other forms of connectivity? We talk fixed connectivity, mobile data and the likes.
Well, I think going back to that data, we need to look at, there are two ways to look at it. There's the ability to, the purchasing power, right? Mm-hmm. Africa, if you look at it in terms of poverty and incomes, we're relatively low. So there's the demand side and then there's the supply side. And in terms of the supply, which is what you're talking about, even though there's been some progress, it's nowhere near what we see in Europe, right? Mm-hmm. Then the second thing is, at what price point is that supply availed to us? That is also a function of at least two things. One, the initial conditions. If you don't have a sufficient scale of that infrastructure, and you don't have a big enough demand, the price per unit is going to be much higher. So the thing is, there's also the issue of the quality of that. You may have the cables, yes, but the energy that drives it, what is the cost of that energy that drives that infrastructure? So we need to look at it from both the supply side and also from the demand side. Now, I think that with time, and also with the kind of regulations that government put in place. So how is that infrastructure availed in that country? Is it through public only, yes, or public-private partnerships? Yes. What are the regulatory regimes that govern the provision of that infrastructure? Yeah. What are the tax structures or subsidies that are provided? What is the enabling environment, meaning that what is government doing in terms of helping to make crowding the private sector have, yes, more competition? So the more competition you have in providing that service, the tendency for the price, yeah, to go down gets higher. Yeah. So just to summarize, it's a function of, well, we're starting from a lower point vis-a-vis the other countries. So there's no surprise, yeah, that the prices will be higher. But given that, our initial conditions, are we doing enough to make this infrastructure available to individuals given the income, relatively lower income levels that we have? Yeah. Let me throw that question to the Minister. Minister Malatsi, having seen that picture, I think that picture talks to affordability, which I know that in your context is a particular sore point for the South African public. What are the factors that are colluding towards that picture that we were seeing in terms of the digital divide, those who have access and those who don't, but also importantly, in terms of driving investment in the economy? Because I imagine that this doesn't reside with governments alone. Governments need to be creating conditions that enable investment
in that infrastructure, right?
Absolutely, and I think there are different key points to highlight that are all contributors to the state of low connectivity levels that we have, and even the cost of that connectivity. One, it's starting with, as the Prof said, I mean, if you just look in terms of poverty levels in the country and the rate of unemployment and the economic status of people, realize that much more people are inclined to spend on basic, what are considered conventional basic needs, which is basically about putting food on the table, water and electricity for survival. But in this day and age, access to connectivity actually as an enabler to be live should be a basic right. But the reality of the matter is, one, you have from the telco's perspective, even as much as progress has been made, and we should always acknowledge that, is that it hasn't been sufficient to ensure that throughout the country that meaningful connectivity. The second element is, have government's efforts been sufficient?
Yeah.
And it's important to have an open and honest conversation in that even the interventions that have been made by government haven't reached with the speed with which it was intended. In our context, the South African government a couple of years ago launched a very noble intervention called the SA Connect, which is intended to expand broadband connectivity to the most rural parts of this country by connecting schools, traditional authorities, government facilities, and all these points that are central to a lot of communities. But it takes all these players in the ecosystem to do the investment where it's needed. The telcos will always use the argument that the reason there isn't such investment in those areas is because commercially there's very low, if non-existent returns on that, and that's why you find gaps at that level. But it also speaks about how, from a regulation perspective, we're using regulation as an enabler to connectivity, as an enabler to opportunities. And this requires that, of course, at different stages, we reassess where we are and be able to respond to the demands of the times that we are in now. Because if we over-rely on the telcos, we are never going to have optimal or even 100% connectivity as we so wish.
So, Minister, there's a bit of an irony, because as you are talking, your line is breaking. And unfortunately, it's one of those situations. Before then, we have to let you go, because I do understand you have other commitments. Just as a parting shot from you then, with the G20 happening and the work that has happened during South Africa's presidency, how much further along do you believe this conversation has been pushed? And the Leaders Summit, with everyone that's going to be in the room, what are the conversations you are looking for that will drive the digital economy forward on the African continent?
Look, I think for South Africa's purposes, we've been able, through the Digital Economy Working Group, to elevate the issue of meaningful connectivity, because it does remain a primary concern. And I think Prof. Marivat will also elaborate on, the approach about maximizing ethical approach to AI and incorporating our diverse language models, even in the language modeling of AI. Because if we are going to speak about inclusion and that inclusivity, it means that the development of the language models must be able to reflect the diversity, not only of our country, but as we expand to the continent. Because inclusion speaks about being able to connect to people in a language of their own. The other element that is important is about digital skills. And I think this is the area that governments across, we need to be working together with the private sector and NGOs in making sure that we digitally upskill our populations. And this requires that we look even deeper at foundational educational levels. That's where we should be starting and making those inroads in, so that we prepare our populations to respond better to the demands of the digital economy. And those require, at the very basic level, elementary digital skills.
All right, let's leave it there with you for this evening. Thank you for having joined the conversation, Minister Malatsi there. We do need to let him go. Stand by, we have more for you coming up in just a moment, focusing on some of the factors that talk to what has been described as a bit of a paradox in as far as digital connectivity on the African continent is concerned. But also we'll talk to Garth Scholtz, who is manager of the South African Broadband Networks, and we'll focus on broadband as one of the elements that need to fall into place in order for Africa to address its digital divide. That and more coming up. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. Now, let's talk to Garth Scholtz, who is the General Manager of the South African Broadband Networks. We just want to get a perspective from him. But before we do that, let me show you the picture as far as the African continent and investment in fiber infrastructure, the trend over the last few years and in which direction it's been going. So you will see there that graphic coming up for us to show you what you've been seeing. So fiber capital investments in South Africa between 2015 and 2025. What you're seeing there is that CAPEX, capital expenditure in fiber, it's been ebbing and flowing really. You have a period around 2020 where it seemed to be, dipping down a little bit, then starting to rise again around 2021, but almost flatlining in the years 2023, 2024, and 2025. And that's followed by mobile CAPEX, which interestingly is actually ticking up a little bit between 2024 and 2025. That would be interesting to understand what are the dynamics. Total CAPEX, though, also appears to be flatlining, and those figures are, as I say, from 2025 to 2015 to 2025. So let's speak to Garth Scholtz then and bring him into the conversation. Garth, please pick up on that graphic that we were showing just now and the work that you do within the infrastructure network system that is seeking to change that picture.
Thank you, Thulasizwe, and thank you for the opportunity to be on your program this evening. So I have the pleasure of heading up an organization called SABC, South African Broadband Education Networks. We are a non-profit company based in Cape Town with the mission of bridging that digital divide between those who have and those who don't have. Our context is education.
Yeah.
We were fortunate enough to receive several $100 million grant from the Department of Higher Education and Training in 2019, the focus of which was to connect public TVET colleges to something called the SANREN network, the South African National Research Network. What this network is if I can provide an analogy, the SANREN network is kind of like a series of interconnected highways that are dedicated to carrying education traffic. And I think, to pick up on some of the earlier points of the minister and also of your guests in studio, what we're doing is really striking at the core of ending bandwidth poverty in South Africa. In fact, our mission is to democratize bandwidth poverty. So we've spent some time connecting TVET colleges in all corners of South Africa, from the most rural Northern Cape and Limpopo to the urban centers of Johannesburg and Cape Town, providing an equal platform of bandwidth for all public TVET colleges to grow their digital platform and to have bandwidth availability where it really counts, and that is in the class. Our end users are students, and that's where this bandwidth is really going to have the most impact, developing the next set of skilled labor that the South African economy so desperately needs.
Yeah, and Garth uses an expression there, Prof. Marivat, bandwidth poverty. That's an interesting phrase.
Sure.
Talk to that a bit more, because you were making the point earlier on that there was always this belief that the internet would be the great equalizer. Has that actually materialized? And if so, what has enabled it? And if not, what's hindering it?
Sure. Yeah, so having access to the internet is one thing when you do get it. How you use it is another thing. So what's been shown in the past is that depending on income level, where you live, you access and use the internet in different ways. When we were thinking about it being an equalizer, it's because everybody's going to have access to information, they will use it and then they will prosper over time. That hasn't been so. Actually connecting this back to before we went on break in terms of infrastructure, one of the things that we've identified as a challenge is language in itself. So language should be treated as infrastructure across. It should not be lost on us that people interact maybe with their phones or with their computers when they do have their bandwidth, and one, their phone might not be able to hear you. You might even speak in South African English, and a lot of Africa is accented, whether it's English or French, before we even go to the 2,000 plus local languages that your phone doesn't understand what you're saying when you're trying to now...
You'll be telling Gemini, please.
Please do this, but it doesn't.
They don't understand your accent.
So just think about that. That becomes another barrier.
Yes.
The other is that we're also making lots of assumptions on the other side of thinking, oh, now the technology is going to be... the bandwidth is available, and then we're building up this digital economy, and then it's going to have AI on the other side. I think there was a recent study from the Global Observatory on AI based here in South Africa that less than 25% of South Africans have heard the term AI. So how do we get and make sure that people have this tooling? On one side, you need to build up the data that you can, this is a different way of data, language data, to be able to build these models that the Minister Malatsi was talking about, and that's not easy. You need to then tap into almost like things like the SABC and the way that they deal with their historical archives, and making sure that some of that becomes available to innovators to be able to build on in an equitable manner, that they can be reshared. Do we have the capability and the capacity in the country of researchers who can actually build these items? And then at the same time, then it's these being able to get into the spaces that people are actually interacting with the internet or needs. So connecting maybe to Garth's area, it might be in education, of saying you want to have, let's say, children having access to education systems that might be in their own languages, but now they're driven through the internet and through a more local language that they're interacting with. Those are layers that require us to do development, to do research, to do these other pieces.
Is it the soft infrastructure as opposed to the hard infrastructure we were discussing?
Yeah, it is both. To train a language model, even small ones, you will need computing access, but you will still also need the human resources of the researchers and the developers who can actually build these types of things. So the bandwidth is one part. I'm not disagreeing. We're going to keep on having to increase that, because obviously as it becomes bigger, there has to be more demand. But as was said by, earlier by Prof, on the demand side, right, it also becomes when people see beyond entertainment that there's gains that they have accessing some of these systems and not just social media. And those barriers are many, and we still need to engage with those barriers as well.
In fact, I think we'll go there immediately after the break and talk e-commerce, the extent to which Africans are participating, because as you are talking about AI and the language gaps and what goes into what you feed these language models, I'm also thinking that there are industries behind all of that. But also importantly, there's something that Prof. Armah has been nudging us about, the energy needs of some of these data centers. So I think let's go there immediately after the break. You're watching G20 Focus. We'll continue with our discussion in just a moment. So I made the point earlier on about social media usage and said that Kenya rules the roost, was the expression I used, in as far as social media usage in the world, not just in Africa, in the whole world. Kenya, the average daily usage is 4 hours and 13 minutes. Then you have Chile second, South Africa 3 hours and 36 minutes. Within that, you also see a number of African countries featuring among those that use social media quite a lot. Take a look at this graphic and see which social media platforms are most popular on the African continent. As you can see there, Facebook, 291 million users. TikTok, 189.3 million users. I must say, I'm hardly surprised by all of that. Then the Messenger, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, now known as X. So those are the popular social media platforms that are driving usage on the African continent. But as you heard in the last few minutes, usage is one thing. What you do with that usage and the economies behind it is really the core of what we've been focusing on. So let me pick up with you, Prof, about the usage of the internet to drive economic activity on the African continent. There's a point you've been trying to nudge us on about these data centers. Strive Masiwa from Zimbabwe, we understand, is working on 5 more of these across the African continent. There's a whole economy of energy behind it. Talk to me about that.
Well, I mean, we think the energy issues, we know that about 600 million Africans don't have access to energy. I don't want to dwell on that because it's not something we can fix tomorrow.
Yes.
What I want to focus on is that we have about 2,400 entities that focus on AI in Africa, right? Of which 41% are startups. They use AI in the area of agriculture to determine soil quality and customize the treatment and agricultural yields to the nature of the soil in a particular plot. That is one. We have AI being used in the area of language, translating African languages so that you can actually relate. You talked about that issue. I think Vula Vula is one of them. We have the use of AI. Ghana. In Ghana, they've developed something called SUA code, where they notice that individuals don't have access, that they use their phones more, so they're using the AI phones to teach coding, right? And we've not even talked about the fact that, you know, the use of mobile telephony for mobile banking, even though the numbers show that we are down, Africa has the highest incidence of use of mobile banking. So people who are underserved use mobile banking to access banking facilities. And then there's also the use of AI to use that use of internet banking to determine your credit access. So it gives you access to the financial sector, but the mobile banking becomes a bridge to access the financial sector. So what we need to do is to be able to harness these talents, right, and link them to the private sector and to government so that we can then begin to develop our own AI systems. Because currently, like we discussed, the AI system depends on data. It's trained on data, but we are not represented in that data sufficiently. So there are biases in that. And so for me, what we need to do is how do we engage in AI in a way that is more meaningful to us? That will be a more inclusive way to do it, because we're using AI to solve our own peculiar problems.
So the energy is there,
but I mean, the energy will not be enough initially, but we need to work on that. The human,
the appetite and the human energy and
but we need to work on the energy axis.
I want to go to Garth in a moment, but please do.
I was going to say what Prof is talking about, Vula Vula, is actually the one of the outputs that came out of our organization, our company, Lelapi AI. And one of the challenges, I think, that people should understand on the other side in terms of the AI companies that are out there is also how much of the pull is coming from inside the continent, right? That you do have large companies, governments saying, no, we need these products for ourselves, because it's one thing to try and also push, but then getting to that point where you're seeing a localized solution and then seeing those actually being part of an ecosystem and not only looking and saying, no, we're waiting for big players to then say we now support. They are going through a lot of other barriers because, again, you do not have readily available data. You don't have necessarily readily available skills that people actually can come in those spaces. Yeah. So they tend to mostly, for example, on the continent, even those big players just have business offices. Yeah. They do not develop the technology here.
Garth, let me bring you back into this conversation. Talk to me about within the space in which you operate, because we were talking about the use of these technologies to tackle our socio-economic challenges that we face. Earlier on, we were talking about how digital technologies actually relate in one way or another to about 70% of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. What are the log jams that need to be opened up in your space that could help the African continent to accelerate building an inclusive digital economy?
Well, in my view, one of the biggest challenges that we face in our context, and that is TVET colleges, is capacity within those colleges. I'd like to push back a bit on what the two professors are saying in the studio regarding AI and adoption of AI. And I'd like to counter that by saying that our experience in TVET colleges is that lecturers, IT staff are not yet ready to receive that sort of technology in the institutions. And that is due to a lack of capacity. In a survey that we conducted in 2020, we found that in 325 TVET campuses, public TVET campuses across the country, there were only 103 technicians to service those 325 campuses, 1 in 3. So the problems faced in the TVET colleges are a lot more fundamental. It's how to upskill the staff that you have there, how to retain those skills at those institutions. Yeah. Remember, we're talking about institutions which are in all 4 corners of South Africa. These are not necessarily the most attractive places to live and work. The sector needs to be capacitated and turn those TVET colleges into attractive places to work, and not losing those skills to the private sector once people are capacitated and get the requisite trainings.
Garth, apologies, Garth. I do need to take a quick break, but I'll let you finish the point that you are starting, because I have a feeling that from the conversations when we talk the human energy, Prof, not the energy of the megawatts. Yeah. When we talk the human energy, that's exactly what Garth is talking to. That's why we should be seeing all of that excitement and energy and innovation. So I'll pick up on that point in a moment. You're watching G20 Focus. Stay with us. I'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. We're drawing towards the conclusion of the show, so let me get final concluding thoughts from my guests. Garth, let me pick up with you. You were making the point about the human energy, the innovation spaces as represented by TVET colleges. Please finish that point for me, please.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make was that in many of these rural communities, the TVET college campus is the nucleus of that community. It's usually a large employer in that particular town. And I also want to say that the people working there are public servants who are trying their best. But sometimes we're expecting them to race in a Formula One race when they've only ever driven a go-kart. And I want to put out a call to action to industry, particularly the tech industry, to put your money where your mouths are, and go and support institutions like the TVET colleges that we serve, because the TVET colleges are at the center of developing the South African skills economy. They are very much within the strategic focus of the Department of Higher Education and Training and government at large. Yeah. And these are the future employees, the future workforce of South Africa. These are the people that are going to be driving industry going forward. And and yes, these are exactly the skills South Africa's economy needs to grow.
All right. Let me bring it back to studio then as we conclude. So those are the points that Garth is making. But as a concluding thoughts from the both of you, how can Africa accelerate an inclusive digital economy? You were talking earlier on, Prof, about virtual migrants. What's that about? Bring that into this conversation.
Well, one of the things that AI facilitates is that you don't need to be physically present in another country to provide services to that country. So if you have the skills, you can actually sell your skills to another country without moving there. So AI actually, in that sense, can increase employment opportunities. But looking at the bigger picture, I think what we need to do, first we need to have national AI strategies. If you compare globally, developed countries, 64% of developed countries have national strategies, 30% of developing countries have that, and LDCs is 12%. Yeah. Now, these strategies have to then take into account the infrastructure factor, the data, the skills, and the regulatory environment, and that will help
Prof.
move us forward.
So I live in both sides of this world, one being at the University of Pretoria as the chair of data science and also director of the new African Institute for Data Science and AI there. We train a lot of honors, masters, PhDs, postdocs working on AI. The challenge is also on the other side. What is the absorption into keeping with those skills? Mm-hmm. We need to have more of that activity, going back to Garth, that people should put their money where their mouth is. Because if not, people, then it becomes, they leave the continent to go somewhere else where those skills can be used. On the other side, at Lelapi AI, the reason we called it that, Lelapi it's a Setswana word for home, was how do we create an environment where African AI researchers can come and work on some of our toughest problems and then build up tools that then become available, and language being the first one, and then building up whether it's speech recognition or translation. Right. There is going to be a need for us to say we need to build up this capability and capacity on the continent, but we should also be driving its demand for it and use. So thanks.
Thank you for having joined me this evening. It was a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of tonight's edition of G20 Focus. Thank you for watching. Join us again next week. We'll be asking the question, can Africa leverage its critical minerals for its own development, as we build up to the G20 Leaders Summit coming up in November. Cheers.